Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Inshallah, as we say here. Spoke about AI, artificial intelligence. Well, I'll bring up the HI, human intelligence. It might be also quite productive and constructive in negotiations. It is now time for us to start the second part of this evening, and I would like to call the distinguished guests that we have as panelists here. You have all the bios, kind of medium-sized bios. I will only talk about the tip of the iceberg of the credentials of each one of the speakers. I will start with Colette Avital. Please, you know what? Colette, and then Hiba Husseini, and then Gillerman, please. All three distinguished diplomats, negotiators. Colette Avital held a variety of key foreign ministry posts. She was ambassador in Lisbon. She was a consul general of Israel in New York, the highest position attained by a woman in the foreign service. In January 1999, she was elected to the Knesset on the labor list. And today, Colette serves as the chairwoman of and the head of the Center of Organizations of Holocaust Survivors in Israel. This is, as I said, just the tip of the iceberg. Hiba Husseini is the managing partner at the law firm of Husseini and Husseini. She chairs the legal committee to final status negotiations between the Palestinians and Israel. She has served as legal advisor to the peace process negotiations since 1994. That's when we met for the first time. And last but not least is Dan Gillerman, ambassador. Gillerman is chair of Markstone Capital Group, Israel's largest private equity fund. Prior to that, as all of you I'm sure know, Dan Gillerman was Israel's representative to the United Nations, and he also served during that time as Vice President of the General Assembly. So thank you for joining us for this evening. I would like each one of you to now take a 5-minute chunk of our time and with opening remarks, and we go with that order, Colette and Hiba and Danny last. You can take it from the podium or seated, whatever you prefer. Okay? Go ahead, Colette, please.
Thank you very much. I think that I'll start by saying that by now everything has been said, but not by me. So, in essence, diplomacy is the art of conducting negotiations. I'm not sure it's a question of the heart. I think it is a question of skills, it's a process. It requires knowledge, flexibility, creativity, and the capacity to listen and to understand the other side. I looked and I revised all the agreements that were sent to us, and the truth is that I did not find much in common. The bilateral agreements which speak about cooperation, their bilateral agreements which bring to an end, successfully or not, a conflict, successfully in the case of Camp David between Israel and Egypt. I think not successfully in as far as Vietnam is concerned, because even though the agreement was signed in 1973, in 1975 it was all but finished, and North Vietnam did what it wanted to do. In some cases, very successful cooperation, like the Élysée agreements between Germany and France, which was signed 18 years after the war and was renewed by Mitterrand and Kohl. And obviously a very important agreement between the USA and the USSR, the SALT I and SALT II agreements, which paved the way, no doubt, to détente. But I think one agreement is standing out and is a little bit exceptional vis-à-vis the other agreements, and that's the Israel-German reparations agreement. In many ways, it was an international precedent because it was an agreement signed by a party in the name of a dispersed people claiming for reparations for suffering when in fact it was not a country, it was not an independent state when the war was going on. It's an important agreement because on the one hand it saved Israel from a sure collapse at that time, a sure economic collapse, and also because it paved the way further on to recognition and to reconciliation. So the question now is, how have these agreements been reached and what did they achieve? I would like just to mention very quickly a few things which I think have been mentioned. I think very importantly, there has never been really an agreement without preparations and behind the scene preparations beforehand. Certainly in every one of these cases, you take for instance the Israel-German agreement, the preparation started at a time when the Israeli public and the politicians did not want to have any contact with Germany. In fact, there was a decision of boycotting Germany, but behind the scenes negotiations or preparations brought about this kind of negotiations. I think track 2 diplomacy is very important. I'm not sure how much has been discussed, but I think track 2 is extremely important because, and it is essential because there's flexibility, there's freedom, there's the possibility to explore how far the other side can go. There's more understanding. There's the creation of empathy and of relations between people. I think that if you look at the Oslo model, while Madrid was being, in a way, standing still, Oslo had that quality of behind-the-scenes track too, which led finally to an agreement. Secrecy is necessary. I think it was also spoken about. If I take the Paris negotiations for Vietnam, for 4 years the negotiations were going on with the same suspects on Rue Kléber in Paris. Every week on Thursday they were meeting, and every week they were saying exactly the same thing to each other and coming out with the same statements, while from May 1970 on, Kissinger negotiated separately, secretly, with the North Vietnamese. I think the level and the status of the negotiators carries a lot of importance. They have to be seen as people of influence. They have to be seen as people who are credible, as people who can be trusted, and as people who have an influence at home. At the same time, the leaders, and I think this has been crucial in every set of negotiations, the leaders, if they're not courageous, if they're not willing to go all the way, if they're not willing to take the risk, if they're not persistent, if there's no perseverance, then it will not go. So you may have good leaders that will reach an agreement. If that agreement is rejected by the public, like in the case of Oslo, if there's not enough preparation of the public opinion at home, then the negotiations really don't go very far. I'd like just for 1 minute to remind us of the outside factors, of the facilitators. In many cases, certainly in our case, there's always been a facilitator. If we're speaking of the Camp David agreements, I think that without President Carter, without the American involvement, we could not have reached, and without the American continued support, these agreements would not have lasted. In Oslo, the Norwegians acted differently, much more discreetly, but as facilitators. In the Good Friday agreements, I think that Tony Blair played a very important role. And again, in Camp David of 2000, Clinton was very much involved, was very much committed, but he did not succeed. So you do have at every stage the international involvement. The Israelis in general have been very reluctant, but I think that in many cases, even if you take Madrid, which is not considered a great success, Madrid did advance in some points. Just one more thing, I don't know how much time I have. I think I would like just to point out that the importance of solving conflicts is the period of time that is devoted to it. And I think that long protracted conflicts don't have too much of a chance to succeed. On the contrary, there's stagnation, there is disappointment, there's lack of trust building up. This is certainly the case of the Israel-Palestine negotiations, which have been going on and not going on for 25 years. This is certainly the case between the Cyprus, North Cyprus and South Cyprus. For the Israel-Palestinian conflict, it is almost a century old. I think it is the longest conflict in modern times. For Cyprus too, it is a conflict that has been with us for over 50 years. They have very much in common. Maybe we'll discuss that a little bit further down, but I think it's important to point out one thing, that protracted conflicts lead to stagnation. Stagnation, in our case, there's less inclination both on the side of the Palestinians and of the Israelis to come back to the conference table, because I think that we're not ready to pay the price. So we are at a stage of conflict management, and I think we will discuss that later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colette. Your last point is worth mentioning, at least the facts before moving on to Hiba. And that is that during those 25 years of negotiations in the Israeli-Palestinian context, we've only had about 10% of the time negotiation on permanent status in 2.5 rounds. Camp David in Taba, Annapolis, and the Kerry round in 2013 and 2014. So it's not 25 years of negotiations, but as you well have put that, is more non-negotiations during that period. Thank you. Now, that's kind of a natural passage towards you, Hiba. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Gilead. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. Madam Ambassador, on the points that you have raised in your closing remarks, I cannot but I agree, because I think, and I restrict my comments only to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as I have not been able to or afford the time to examine all the other agreements like you have, because I'm engaged in a daily practice of law. I solve other people's problems as opposed to focusing on this issue these days. I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course, all of us know, is part of the global conflicts that reign around us and are becoming increasingly prevalent in the Arab world, and we cannot but be part of that entire conflict. And also, as the world order today, rule of law, the international value system, the international norms are all shifting and changing before our own eyes. So we, the Palestinians and the Israelis, are also struggling to find our own place within this global conflict and the global changes. Closer to the theme of the session, I think back in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s, when we opted for a conflict resolution as opposed to a continued state of resolution, we entered the negotiations in good faith. We entered the negotiations with the aim to build trust and confidence. And we created a balance at that time between our minds and our hearts. We created a balance between what our interests are and what our emotions are dictating. And therefore, that led us to sign peace agreements, interim as they may have been, but we started the process. Unfortunately, as we started getting more into the details, determining that the price on the emotional, on the historical, on the political, and on the economic level were too heavy to pay, we started having our hearts take over our brains. And we allowed the right on both sides to take hold and divert the prospect from a two-state solution to a continued managed state of conflict and to unilateral action. And I think this is where we have missed the opportunity, both of us, of course, on both sides. I think going forward, we can and we should regain the balance. I think having established that we can, at some point in history, use our minds to address the conflict in an objective way, notwithstanding all the emotional, subjective aspects of it, is still an opportunity. How we figure within the global order, within the regional order and the new order, and without having an independent third-party broker that would also help us solve the crises as they emerge during negotiations, is going to be very important. But I think I would say we, the Palestinians, are close to Israel here. We are closer than our Arab neighbors, and I think it is important to maintain that we are the primary partner for Israel, not the Arab neighbors. The Arab neighbors are going to be of added value for normalization, but if we, the Palestinians, find ourselves more and more sidelined, especially as the pie, the land, so to speak, is getting smaller and smaller. I like to offer an anecdote here. As I was driving with my friend Akram from Jerusalem, we were saying, it's like, we the Palestinians started with 10 shekels. That was like sort of the exchange for peace, the value, the monetary value in exchange for peace. Today, we owe Israel 10 shekels. So the pie is getting smaller and smaller, and I think if we allow the opportunities and unilateral action to take us closer, to bypass an opportunity with the Palestinians, the Arab Palestinians, and move towards the neighbors and only the neighbors, then I think we are setting ourselves for more failures. So to emphasize your points, I think it's negotiations, it's compromise, and we have to establish the opportunity again for a long-term peace between ourselves and the conflict. We both are here to stay. We have a joint history, we have a joint destiny, and we have a joint tradition to a large extent, of course. So I think it is very important for both of us to look again at ourselves, not at other parties, pay the emotional price, the economic price, the political price, and pave the way to a joint negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiba, for your comments. And now on to you, Ambassador Gillerman.
Thank you, Gilead. I must start with a confession. Whenever I'm sitting with the logo of the INSS behind me, and such distinguished colleagues on both my sides, and such a knowledgeable and experienced audience, the German ambassador and our ambassador to Germany, and Udi and Dan Mirador and many others, I'm reminded of that story of a 8-year-old boy who was the only survivor of the big flood in 1887 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And from the age of 8, all he did was travel from village to village in his cart and tell the story of how he survived the flood. And at the ripe old age, he reached heaven, and the angel in charge of activities in heaven asked him, what can you do? And he said, I can tell people how I survived the flood of, the big flood in Johnston, Pennsylvania in 1887. And the angel said, I don't think this is going to be very impressive. I mean, we have people here who've survived Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, this is no big deal. He said, look, that's all I know. That's all I did for 98 years. So he said, let me consult my superior. And a few minutes later, he came down and he said, I have good news and bad news for you. The good news is you can tell people how you survived the flood. The bad news is Noah is going to be in the audience. So I feel as if I'm addressing an audience of Noah. I'm also I feel very fortunate to participate in a debate in a panel which is also co-sponsored by Germany, because I really feel that two of my colleagues, two great people, two great men, who were also my mentors, both in the business world, which I came from and went back to, and in the diplomatic world, were very prominent German people. In the business world, it was the then president of the Deutsche Industrie- und Handelstag, Otto Wolf von Amerungen, and at the UN it was Dr. Matusek, who I'm sure you worked with, and who was a great colleague. So I'm very grateful to them also for all they did to teach me both how to be a businessman and also, to some extent, how to negotiate. But I would like to touch on a few aspects which were already mentioned, but maybe elaborate about them very, very, very shortly. One is actually the question of secrecy, track 2, back channel. I think you, Ambassador, actually mentioned, you said that, negotiations should be discreet, and I think you said behind closed doors was the term which you mentioned. And I think that is very, very true. And I must say I'm reminded, talking of great men, of a dinner I had quite a few years ago with Shimon Peres, who was then president of Israel, and it was when the negotiations were really at their height. I mean, Obama was making 5 speeches a week, and Bibi Netanyahu was making 6 speeches a week, all about peace, and speech making to a great extent took over from peacemaking. And I remember Shimon Peres saying to me, "This has no chance. This is not going anywhere." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because it's too public. And basically, there are 2 things in life I should not do in public. One is to make love, and the other one is to make peace. In both cases, it's a good idea to have your eyes slightly shut and the lights slightly dimmed." And I think he was right, as he was in many other cases. I think that, especially in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I have many friends who are involved in it, whether it's Dennis Ross or Martin Indyk or others. And I always say, and I think Colette knows that very well, and Gilead does as well, if you're involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one thing is for sure, and that is your job security. It's a lifetime job. It's not going to be solved, and you're going to be there forever, talking, negotiating, formulating, compromising, starting and restarting. Now that is really, I think, a very pessimistic view. And I would try and opt for the more optimistic view. And that is that we do have a chance. We have a chance also because, as Dr. Husseini said, we have no choice. We are either destined or doomed to live here side by side forever. There's no other way, there's no other place. And therefore, eventually, we will have to find a way. I think one of the reasons that we are not there yet is because for too long we've been talking about a marriage, when actually what we should be talking about is an amicable divorce. But I think that another reason that it is, has been stalemated or stuck for such a long time is also the fact that we, as Israelis, and I'm saying this as self-criticism, have never actually defined what it is we really want, what we want to be, what our borders are, elementary things which every nation, I don't know, I don't want to go as far as exaggerating, but I think that Israel may actually be one of the very few countries in the world which after 70 years has still not defined for itself what its borders are. So I think that if we go back to the elementary, and at the end of the day we all know that when you talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you're talking about three core issues. You're talking borders, you're talking right of return, and you're talking Jerusalem.
Settlements.
Well, borders are settlements are part of the borders, territory. And I think that, the frustrating thing to me is that we all know, and Dr. Husseini may not agree with me, that the 1967 borders are not an option. They're not an option primarily because in 1967 there was no contiguity between Gaza and the West Bank, so some other kind of borders have to be defined. We also know, and again I'm sure that Dr. Husseini will not agree with me, that the right of return is a non-starter. So what remains is Jerusalem. And I think that probably, and Dan can be much more, definitive and experienced and knowledgeable about that than I, that, you can be, by being creative, and maybe the process has somewhat started, you can solve that too. The thing is, do we actually negotiate knowing exactly what it is that will end up, as the ambassador said, a win-win situation? Now, I want to point out one other thing, and that is that I think that sometimes negotiations are important just for the sake of having them. And I will explain what I'm saying. I mean, and I'm actually, I would like to, I'll add that maybe in 1 second, but we have always had it better, most of the times, internationally, diplomatically, security-wise, in every sense of the word, while we were talking. While we were talking seriously and in earnest, carrying on credible, real negotiations, our situation and the Palestinian situations and the region situations were better than when we were not. And therefore, I think, and I will maybe refer to a much higher authority, and that is Dr. Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger told me a few years ago, he said, look, tell your friend, he meant Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he said, tell your friend to learn from Metternich. Dr. Kissinger, as some of you may know, did his PhD on Metternich, who was probably the world's, founder of international relations and diplomacy. He said, Metternich always said that when there is a conflict, don't allow that conflict to be between two. Because if it's two, it's you against the other side. Always bring in a third party, and then make sure you're one of the two, and you're not the one who is alone. I'll let you guess who he thought might be the third party. I think he meant the Palestinians, actually. And I think he also meant the Palestinians because he also believed, and I noticed, Dr. Husseini, that you said, when you said we missed an opportunity, and you hastened to say we both did, and I agree with you. But there's also that very famous saying of my most illustrious predecessor who said that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So I think that I'm not asserting it as a truth, I'm just quoting Abba Ibn, but I think what Dr. Kissinger, what Henry meant was, if really, be the good guys, talk, negotiate, agree with the Americans, go along with them, and, if it's true, you can always trust the Palestinians to be the guilty party. So to sum up, what I'm saying is negotiations, and I don't think there's any doubt, otherwise nobody would be here. Negotiations are important. Sometimes they're important because they're being held and because they're being carried out. But I totally agree that the end game and the wish should be a win-win situation. As I mentioned, I was a business person. I was picked by Shimon Peres, who was then foreign minister, and Arik Sharon, who was prime minister, to be Israel's ambassador to the UN, which I think is the first time they picked someone from the private sector. And I cannot even begin to tell you, maybe I'll have the chance later, how frustrating it was for a business person who used to be, to negotiate deals, to come to that multilateral arena and be engaged in endless negotiations where I found myself once at least negotiating for 11 hours, not on a paragraph, not on a sentence, not on a word, but on a letter. 11 hours on the letter S, in case you're interested. I'll elaborate later. But I still believe in negotiations, and I think that they're the only way in which we, in this very troubled region of ours, could finally achieve a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all three of you. We are now going to follow up with a series of questions and answers. Keep your answers short, because we would like to take questions from the floor as well. Just two quick comments on Dan, what you said. Traditionally we speak about four core issues, including security. So we have Jerusalem, within Jerusalem, the old city and the holy sites. Then we have territories, which includes, of course, settlements, boundaries, and the territorial exchange. We have refugees, and within that, right of return, yes, no, whatever you think about that. And of course, security arrangements, which is the fourth sticking point sometimes, not the ultimate one, because in most rounds of negotiations in the past, the sticking point was indeed Jerusalem, and not any of the other core issues. And yes, in this institute, we are trying to determine where does Israel want to go. What's the objective of the negotiations or whatever we do here, and that is to keep Israel as the democratic nation home of the Jewish people, which I believe is the fundamental core of the Declaration of Independence, 1948 Declaration of Independence of ours. But I would like to ask you to refer to, we spoke about diplomacy, we spoke about dialogue, we spoke about secrecy and backtrack negotiations, track 2 negotiations. And my question to you would be whether you think that at this point in time, in the 21st century, when everything is so transparent, and the reaching out of each one of the negotiators and each one of the individuals that the constituencies comprise of, is it still possible to really negotiate in an era of such a transparent character? And I'll go the other way around now, this time, please, Dan.
Well, it's a very good question, Gilad. I would say that in a world where 15 Saudis thought they could get away with landing in a private plane in Istanbul and going into the consulate and butchering a journalist and get away with it, probably everything is possible. But and I think you've made a very, very poignant point, and that is, everything today is so transparent, everything is on camera, everything is, it's very, very difficult to keep things secret. But on the other hand, and maybe, I belong to a, fading generation, but I still believe very much in the human touch, in human contact, in looking each other in the eye, in being in the same room, in feeling and sometimes even touching, but certainly, having a dialogue which is one of trust. I think there is no substitute for it now. Having said that, I'm saying that because I don't think that technology, that doing things by video conference or doing things by tweeting, I don't think tweeting is policy, but I know there are people in higher places who do believe in it. But I still believe, and we do hear from time to time about, things which happened and have been kept secret for a long time, actions which nobody took any credit for, whether they're military actions or diplomatic actions. So my answer would be, yes, it is much more difficult. Yes, the world we live in is much more transparent, much more open, much more difficult to create that kind of environment. But I think, I personally believe that it is still possible.
Fair enough.
I think, it's one thing to be transparent, it's another thing to negotiate in secret. And I think it's up to the negotiators to agree on what information they will share and at what time. So timing, the nature of the information, and the level of detail. I think everybody in Israel and in Palestine, if we were to take our conflict, of course, pretty much knows the issues and understands that we're negotiating over Jerusalem, and of course the holy sites, and over the four issues, the borders, the refugees, and security. So I still believe, notwithstanding technology, notwithstanding the right of people also to access information and to know what's going on, I think that at some point in time, the negotiators have to decide when and what do they share. So I believe in some level of secrecy, but not in terms of the fact that they're negotiating.
The question is whether the social networks and the possibility of that to undermine those efforts is not a component you should take into consideration.
I think so. I think that basically when you disclose, I think that what we see even today with all the transparency is the tip of the iceberg. I think a lot is happening underneath that we do not know because the secrecy is still kept. And I think there's a very big danger in disclosing what is happening in negotiations, because then the negotiators become intransigent, lose their flexibility, become entrenched in the official positions, don't have anymore the leeway, the possibility to come with creative ideas if it is done in the public. So I think that secrecy is important, is necessary, and I think that it is possible and it is still happening.
Well, I venture to agree. But, since we have the German ambassador here and we have you two, my question to you, Colette, is whether you see an advantage in having a little bit more normal ratio between women negotiators and men negotiators, since we had, I think, less than a one-digit percentage of women negotiators in all the agreements that we've covered. Would that be an issue that you would like to see?
Well, in the year 2000, the United Nations passed a resolution 1425, which demanded, or which asked the countries to involve more women in all the processes, political negotiations, etc. I think it is very important, and I think that women bring to the table something different. First of all, I think we listen more. Second of all, I think we have perhaps more empathy. We're less bound to be competitive when we come to negotiations. And to give you a short answer, I believe there should be more women negotiating. I think that possibly the results could be different.
A different idea? Hiba, you were there, so you're for it, I know.
I think, I was there, but I think we were very few in numbers, and I think it's very, very important to have a balance. We as a Palestinian team, I think we're still far from having more balance within our own team. I think the issues, we're still a very patriarchal society, and we still don't see women as leaders.
You're not alone in that.
But I agree with you, Ambassador Colette, on everything you said in terms of the empathy, in terms of the ability to bridge gaps and to find working solutions. There you have it.
Danny, I'm going to put to you a different question here. You want to add something? Colette,
ironically, when at one point there were serious negotiations going on with Tzipi Livni heading the delegation, and I was in the Knesset, we did come to her and we did ask her to include more women, especially since on the other side we knew that there were women, and unfortunately this didn't happen.
You can ask Udi afterwards.
Secrecy, right? What women were negotiating?
There was, in each group of negotiation, there were women.
One woman.
No one. Some of them only women. In the
Udi, speak to the mic. Okay.
But I know that the image is more important than facts and details. I know that.
I'll be glad to learn the details.
We have to talk facts here. Danny, you spoke about, 11 hours of negotiating, one letter, not even one word. And the question is, once again, in this era of technology, of openness, of global interaction between individuals, etc., how important do you think the interpersonal relationship is, the chemistry between the negotiators, the chemistry between the leaders? I'm not even talking about trust. I'm talking about what happens in the room after the door is closed behind the negotiators.
Well, anyone who saw Hamilton would know the importance of being in the room where it happens. I don't know how many of you were lucky enough to see it, but you should. I think it's very important. I still believe, and I said that before, I believe that personal relations do count. I can give you an example, from the UN. I really believe, many people discount the importance of the UN, and in Hebrew we still quote Ben Gurion as saying shmum. I think that, one of the, beyond it being the world's parliament and the only place where 193 countries sit together and talk, it's probably one of the few places where you can interact with ambassadors and usually very high-ranking personalities and very important people in their own countries who represent countries that do not recognize you and may even be hostile to you. And by creating an atmosphere of trust and having a dialogue which is based on mutual respect, actually bring dividends to your country that far outweigh the importance of any vote at the UN. And I can tell you from personal experience that I had, numerous relationships with with ambassadors of countries that do not have diplomatic relations with us, that are even perceived as hostile to us. All of them were very, very prominent. except for Israel, most countries send the most prominent people to the UN. And then in the Arab countries, there are also relatives, usually cousins or brothers of the emir or the sultan or the king, which gives them extra weight. And I can tell you that I believe humbly that I have brought more, important dividends to Israel, important information, important issues with the countries, some of whom I still cannot name, but even countries like Pakistan and countries like Qatar or Oman and other countries. I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, during my tenure, I was at the UN for less than 6 years, just nearly 6 years. 14 of my colleagues became foreign ministers, including Sergei Lavrov.
How about you?
I'm not one of the 14. But Sergei Lavrov of Russia, Mohammad Jawad Zarif of Iran, many, the Egyptian ambassador, many others. And that shows you the stature of these people. And if you develop a relationship with these people, I think it's very important. And also with friendly countries. I can tell you that one of the reasons that at the end of the day, Resolution 1701, which is another example of negotiations, we did end with a resolution, would not have ended the way it did were it not, among others, the relationship I had with John Bolton, who at the time was the American ambassador, or the US ambassador to the UN, and actually, was very, very helpful sometimes in sidelining the State Department and getting the National Security Council or the White House on board when it really counted. So I think personal relations are very important, and even in today's day and age, I don't think that there is a substitute for them.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, and my personal experience is quite similar. I mean, people we've negotiated with during our time, during Udi's time, I think that we kept the relationship not really on hold, but ongoing throughout this period, even though we did not reach an agreement, and we've negotiated quite fiercely. Still, the personal relationship is still there, even until today. And from time to time, it also allows us to overcome obstacles, even as has-beens or as non-officials, when terrible, harsh things happen between Palestinians and Israelis. It allows an open line of communication, which is based on the relationship, and I believe that this is quite true in this case as well.
I would. On the Israeli side, nobody gives you second opportunity.
What do you mean?
On the Palestinian side, most of the people in the key positions of the negotiation, they are still there. And in Israel, every time we bring in other people.
Yeah.
That's right.
You have to start almost from the beginning.
No, but I think what Gilad said is right, that even after you finish being in a position, if you have created a relationship and it lasts, I'll give you a very quick example. Long after I've left the UN, there was an issue which the Prime Minister asked me to try and help with, had to do with the Goldstone report at the time. And one very important person I had to meet, or he wanted me to speak to, was the Russian ambassador who replaced Sergei Lavrov, Ambassador Churkin, who died prematurely and very suddenly. And I went to New York, actually, and we were supposed to meet on a certain day. I just went for one day, and then it turned out that evening there was an NBA game between the Knicks and LeBron James was on the other side. And I got 2 tickets from David Stern, and I knew that Vitaly Churkin was a great sports lover. He was an Olympic skier. His wife was an Olympic ice skater. It was a great couple, and I called him, and he said he was very busy that evening. He had 2 functions, one with the Secretary General, the other one with the Ambassador of Singapore. And I said, what a pity. And he said, why? And I said, because I happen to have 2 tickets for this game. And he said, what time is the game? And I said, 7:30. He said, where are you staying? I said, I was at dinner. And he said, give me 2 minutes. And 30 seconds later, he called up. He said, I'll pick you up. And I can tell you that, and, I was no longer ambassador. But I had the tickets.
That's a much higher position.
Yeah. And I can tell you, well, I'll add one other thing, which in today's Me Too world may not be accepted properly, but another advantage was that next to me was Natalie Portman no, but what I'm saying, and I think that is true, and I think everybody in this room who's ever negotiated will attest to that. Over beers and hot dogs at Madison Square Garden, we achieved more than we would have achieved in any conference room.
Undoubtedly. Okay, I'll now turn on to you, please, the audience. If you have any questions to any of the panelists or a general question addressed to all of them, please go ahead. Speak up.
Okay. I'm Sneha, and I'm a student of security and diplomacy at TAU International. My question is to Ambassador Colette. You said that secrecy is a mandate during negotiation. Also, during conflict, we should understand that conflict doesn't have a very long lifetime because of the stagnancy which comes in. But the person or the people that we should negotiate with should have some kind of impression back at home. When we talk about conflict, what kind of group are we talking about when we talk about negotiation? Because most of the groups in conflict zones are terrorists. So when we say that we have to negotiate, who is the other party that we negotiate with? Who have influence at home?
I'm not sure I totally understood your question, but I'll say this. To the best of my knowledge, when there's a conflict, there are mirror images. I don't trust you for certain reasons, and you don't trust me for exactly the same reasons. And the conflict, this is how the conflict builds up. And therefore, the question in negotiations and the question in preparing negotiations is if you can start creating a kind of dynamic where people start understanding who is in front of you. You're not going to negotiate, I'm not going to negotiate with Sweden. I have to negotiate with people who have at stake something very important because they feel that I am, if not their enemy, the person who is standing between them and statehood, between them and independence, between them and dignity, between them and the possibility to live alongside Israel. So those are the people that I have to negotiate with. Those are the people that I have to try to gain their trust, and at the same time to lower some of my feelings of not trusting them.
Okay.
My question was more directed towards the terrorist organization because that are the groups which are present in the conflict.
You mean if we should or we should not negotiate with the terrorist organizations?
For example, Hamas and Gaza, if we want to solve it.
I personally believe that we should negotiate with everyone.
Yeah, we should.
Yes.
Okay, other questions? Got.
The issue of AI was brought up, so I would like to bring it back up. Let's say if there is a way, if the robot, for example, if it's smarter than us, if it takes all the research papers that have been put together, is there a way that we can create sort of a hybrid where there is all this extra information that is given to the negotiations that is based on AI and all these sort of things, and to combine it with the human touch and everything, and to kind of realize that we're in a new era, and to utilize all this information in the closed doors and everything like this.
Let's pick up one or two more questions. Go ahead.
I don't believe believe in robots. But,
I'm the ambassador of Norway. Thank you very much for the interesting panel and interesting speeches. Thank you very much to my colleague. I share all that has been said, but I want to give one invitation and two remarks. The invitation is I absolutely concur in the fact that we need secrecy in negotiations. We need back channels. And if you need one place to go, come to Norway. We do it.
There is a long tradition.
We can keep secrets. It is possible if the parties want it, it can be done. My two observations are the following. I think that we focus too much on the agreement, because the result of peace negotiations is a new social contract. It's a new way to live together, and that has to be established. The second remark is that in order to do that, we need inclusion, both in the process and in everything we do. So I concur again with what you said about women, but not only women. We need better systems for including people in the process and afterwards when we have open negotiations. It's very, very important. We tried the people-to-people program here. It was successful to a large extent, but we need to do it on a much more systematic basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation as well. I can tell you that in the preparatory stage for the Camp David summit, we were invited by one of your neighbors, Goran Persson, in Sweden, for a couple of rounds of secret talks, and so we flew out from here, just 4 negotiators, Shlomo Ben-Ami and Abu Ala, Hassan Asfour, and myself, in the private airplane of the Prime Minister of Sweden. And we landed somewhere in a military base, brought under full secrecy to Harpsund, which is the residence of the Prime Ministers of kind of a remote place of Sweden. And it only took about 6 hours after we went to sleep that I got a phone call from Gilead Sahal's reporter asking me whether Israelis and Palestinians are meeting somewhere in Scandinavia or Northern Europe in secrecy to discuss the core issues. So much for the secrecy. I think that this would be the last question for this panel. Go ahead, please.
This past August, President Trump said that...
No, we can't hear you. So either you come up front here.
This past August, President Trump said that Israel will have to pay a higher price in negotiations because of the Jerusalem. I was wondering if, one, you guys had any speculation to what that might be, and number two, if he was able to extract something significant from Israel, would the Palestinians then accept him or the U.S. as a mediator, as a biased mediator?
So, one more question, or? Okay, this is the very last one because we still have some way to go. Go ahead.
Ambassador of Chile in Israel. Currently I live in Israel.
I can't hear you. I don't know about the other panelists here, but I can't hear you.
I'm a former ambassador of Chile in Israel, currently living in Israel. I want to know, I absolutely support negotiations and everything what you said, but I want to know, what about education for peace in both sides of the conflict? Because there can be a lot of negotiations, but if you have societies that are not prepared for peace, nothing will be done.
Excellent question. I think we have 2 excellent questions that could serve for wrapping up for each one of you. Dan, you start first, and please go ahead.
Well, as to the first question, I would not be as presumptuous as to think that I can outguess President Trump. So,
That's right.
When he said that Israel would have to pay a price, or I'm not sure these were the exact words, but that was sort of the overall meaning. He probably meant that, he's doing something which Israel has asked for, wanted, preached for, prayed for all these years, and in return Israel would have to be more forthcoming when it comes to the Palestinian demands. I think this is probably a fair assumption. You give something, you expect something in return. It wasn't Trump who actually said itnu yikablu, but whether the Palestinians will then accept President Trump or his team or Jared Kushner or the others as fair mediators or honest brokers, I don't see that, they have much choice. With all due respect to all the other parties who are showing willingness to be mediators, and I totally appreciate the invitation to Norway, although I hope it's not limited to December. But when is the best? December. It's the best? Really? Okay. At the end of the day, I think that any agreement which would involve not just Israel and the Palestinians, but the entire region, and obviously Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and others, who I think, we did not mention them much. I mean, Dr. Husseini did mention the fact that no agreement can be reached which leaves out the Palestinians. And I don't think that the moderate Arab and Muslim states would enter into an agreement forsaking the Palestinians. Not that there's much love lost there, I think, but they realize that they cannot afford to do it. So I think any agreement which would involve the larger moderate Arab and Muslim state, and this is a subject for a whole, different panel and different negotiation, because I think at the end of the day, that's probably what we should all strive for. When the fight for supremacy in the Muslim world is between two countries or not even Arab, Turkey and Iran, and Egypt wants to regain its supremacy over the Arab world, I think that's what we should do. But I think, to answer your question, no agreement will be reached, can be reached, I think, without having the support and the active involvement of the United States. As to your question, very, very, very important, I think, and very poignant question about education. Yes, I think it is a prerequisite to educate children for peace, certainly not to incite children for hatred and for killing. I'm not sure we're doing a perfect job in that, certainly not in the last few years, but I'm certain that the Arab world and the Palestinians are still doing a very, very poor job, and I would say even a horrible job when it comes to incitement. And when you raise a generation on hatred, it is difficult to expect them to become friends and believe in peace.
Hiba?
Thank you. I think on education, I agree. It's very important to have education on both sides. I think. I live in Jerusalem, and I go to the West Bank, Ramallah daily, and I go to Hebron, and I go to Nablus, to the courts. I can tell you there's incitement across the board on both sides. There's also a systematic policy approach to rendering each side, on the one hand, a victim, on the other hand, an aggressor. So I think I agree that starting early on in the schools, starting early on in the schools would be very important. On the U.S. role, sure, the U.S. still has a role to play. I think we all recognize that, and we recognize the role of other states, both regionally and internationally. However, it would have to be an honest, fair engagement. We, the Palestinians, cannot continue to be treated unequally and to be treated as a lesser partner in the peace, in a potential peace agreement, in a negotiation with a broker. I think to some extent the U.S., especially with this administration or this president, has rendered itself less credible, less credible in brokering a peace agreement and in a negotiated settlement. And if they wish to regain the broker role, I think credibility will be very important, and they would have to establish it.
I think I'll take from where you've ended, Hiba. I think, unfortunately, that this administration has done a lot to alienate itself from the Palestinians, and therefore I don't see how, at the moment, they can play a useful role. And by the way, vaguely I heard today on the radio that they do not intend to publish very soon their peace plan. They have decided to postpone it again. Now, I'd like to say two words. There's a question of incentives and disincentives. There's no incentive that the United States can propose today to Israel or to the Palestinians which would probably push the peace process forward for opposite reasons. First, because the Israelis get almost everything without having to do something in return anyhow. And paying the price means that what you have to give up, and I don't think at the moment anyone is asking Israel to give up something. And second, the disincentives may be something that should be considered. In other words, you give somebody an incentive progressively. Upon progress, you give something. Excuse me if I go back 1 second to Cyprus. Cyprus in the year 2004 was about to negotiate. The price would have been at that time to be a member of the EU, but it was already a thing that they had achieved, so there was no incentive. On the other hand, if the membership in the EU would have been conditioned upon progress in the negotiations, maybe that would have worked. And I think that this is one of the ideas that should be explored when we talk about the possibility to restart the peace process. And to answer the question of education, unfortunately, at least as far as I know, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, every Minister of Education in this country has had a different agenda. We had the minister who started the idea of peace education. She put on the agenda at that time even studying the Nakba. And I think it was a good thing because you have to try to understand how the other person understands and feels. And then came another minister who immediately abolished it. So unfortunately, peace education is also a question of politics. I highly believe in it. It just doesn't happen now because on both sides we're being brainwashed, and on both sides speak to the average Israeli. He will say, today we have no partner. Why? Because this is what he's been hearing all the time. If we have no partner, the other side also says we have no partner. And this is where we cannot get anywhere unless we believe that this is the only possibility. Those are the people that we have to negotiate with and stop brainwashing.
Thank you very much. I'd like you to join me in thanking Colette Avital, Hiba Husseini, Dan Gillerman. Thank you very much.